Hi, everyone. My name is Arry, chair of the Cascadia Blockchain Council, and also your host with the Blockchain Underground, the Windshield Time podcast. I'm here to introduce Jamiel Sheikh. He came and talked to us about CBDCs. CBDC stand for Central Bank Digital Currencies. I know a lot of us here in the crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain space, we think about CBDCs and we go, ugh, it's anti-humanity, it's anti-privacy, it's anti-security. But what Jamiel talked to us about kind of opened my eyes a lot, and I hope you'll learn as much as I did. It was a very, very interesting perspective that he shared with us. Just a reminder, we have these AMAs, Ask Me Anythings, every Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. PST. You can find us on meetup.com under Blockchain Underground. Don't forget to review, rate, subscribe, and share. And thanks for joining us. All right, enjoy. All right, thank you everyone for joining us on this AMA on CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currencies. We have Jamiel Sheikh with us to talk about it and answer all of our undying questions on this topic. So I'm really thankful for you having joining us, and thank you for being with us, Jamiel. Jamiel, you want to give us a quick intro of yourself? You can go longer too, it's okay. I know because you do a lot of things. Tell us all about yourself and how you got into the crypto and CBDC space, and yeah, start with an intro.
Yeah, sure. First of all, Arry, thank you so much for allowing me to come to your group. It's an honor to be here. So thank you for the privilege and opportunity to kind of interact with your community. My name is Jamiel. I'm based in New York, and I'm kind of, my background is fintech. I've been in fintech maybe 20 plus years, working in banking and things like that. I started coding when I was 12 profusely and won awards by the time I was 13. So I love coding. If all I could do is code, I would. I just can't. I run the largest blockchain community in New York City. It's called Blockchain NYC. We're past 30,000 people. So we do a lot of classes and events in New York City around anything to do with blockchain, Web3, metaverse, DeFi, NFTs. I'm an author. I wrote a book on the Corda blockchain for O'Reilly called Mastering Corda. I'm right now writing a book for Columbia Press on DeFi for the kind of casual reader, not business person, but the casual reader who's not technical. The Mastering Corda was technical, so for developers. I'm an adjunct at Columbia Business School, NYU CUNY, and I actually will be joining two other schools, one in China and one in Germany soon as a visiting scholar. I'm a fellow at Columbia Business School. I'm on the board of a few companies. I advise a bunch of different companies, but the most important one is the Society of Women Coders. And we kind of do some of the hard work of going to these very difficult places and getting a lot of young girls empowered to be a little bit more independent through technology, understanding technology, and be able to build their own business and things like that. And I've been doing that for about a year and a half, 2 years as the CEO. Kavya Krishna, who leads all that effort. I'm just kind of behind the scenes supporting her and getting her in touch with the right people and the capital and all that. And then when it comes to CBDC, I run a CBDC conference called the Cbdc Summit. If you go to cbdcsummit.com, we announced one for later this year. I did one last week in DC. I run something called a Cbdc think tank. It's just a group of people that are trying to figure this space out and to get together and share information. I run cbdcinsider.com, blockchain101.com. Those are web assets. I run some popular conferences, DeFiCon, you may have heard of it in New York City. I run that, and I just came back from the Barclays Center in Brooklyn just literally an hour ago, and we just toured it. And we'll probably do a conference there later in the summer around metaverse called, the name of the conference will probably be In Real Life, IRL. And we'll get some kind of like stars up there and stuff like that, a little bit more entertainment based. So that's kind of my background. I have an MBA from Columbia. I'm doing my second master's at Georgia Tech in AI. Yeah, that's it. I'm a single dad and I have 2 daughters.
I'm exhausted listening to you. I'm like, yeah, do this all.
The overachiever. Yeah, my main product I'm working on is called Instamint, which is a B2B API for minting and managing NFTs for the enterprise use case. So if you want to mint municipal bond or image or all that, and you don't want to hire a smart contract developer, you can just through kind of like what Stripe is for payments, we're there for NFTs. We just raised about 500K seed. We got investment from Algorand, Harmony, Near, Polygon, and a
Nice.
few others are coming in. So
Awesome. Wow. I guess what attracted you to put so much time into CBDCs in the first place? Because you've got the CBDC think tank and all these different things going on. Like, why go in that direction?
like whenever I'm confused about something, I try to set up something where people can learn and I can learn. And for me, it was just incredibly confusing. Like, what is CBDCs about? I'm still not entirely sure, despite speaking to hundreds of banks and all that. But I think this is like late 2019, early 2020, that we announced a CBDC summit. Obviously, it never happened because of COVID. And then early 2021, we put together a think tank. I put together a think tank just to get people, because we're getting all these questions, and I didn't have answers to those questions. Nobody really did. And so I said, listen, there needs to be a forum for people that are not elitist, right? That are like not about, well, this is only for bankers kind of a thing, to come together. Funny thing that happened, which kind of changed the trajectory of how I worked, was I wrote a book on this DLT. And once we announced the summit on January 2020, which was the first ever, that company called us up and said, get out of the CBDC space. It's ours. And that's when I got really angry. And the next morning I launched cbdcinsider.com, just like a, F you, and you can't control the space. It's not that old world. So I launched that. And for me, I'm just interested in education, right? So education is really important. And so we do a lot of education in New York, a lot more obviously with before COVID, and we're getting back to it again. And so the think tank was a way to like learn, to kind of build a little bit of a grand central, so that people can come together and exchange ideas and learn. And it was open to quote unquote the common man or the common woman. And we can interact, and then it grew from there. And then banks started getting involved, and then we started advising banks. So now I'm actually advising some central banks on digital currency and DeFi and things like that. Last week we did a CBDC workshop in person in DC, and I did a talk on AMMs, and and it was a lot of the banks were interested in that kind of stuff. Less so they were less interested in like more of the boring things around CBDC, but more interested in like what's the future of finance, and how do they position and all of that. So the real reason is education, to learn. Really, that's the main motivation, to really understand and speak to the people that are these powerful people that can change how we do things, and learn what's in their heads and kind of help them think things through. And then also the process for the rest of us to understand, all of this.
Obviously, your brain goes really, really, really fast, so I'm still catching up. What is AMN or AMM? And then can you tell us
the automated market making, like Uniswap and all that, right? So, so they're so Curve Finance, for example, you can swap stable coins. Right. And so my presentation was, that's a precursor of possibly of an FX exchange. If we have CBDCs can be swapped, right? And that might be a precursor to how a market might look like in 10 years, and for us to look and understand why and how Curve came into being and why it's being used excessively. Like, people would not think that there's a need to swap stable coins, but there is a significant demand for that kind of stuff, right? And so so really, like, we're trying to help with the cross pollination of information and breaking down these silos of like them and they and they and they, and like the crypto is evil and bad versus banks are evil. Well, maybe banks are a little bit evil, but kind of like bring some of that. And then it was that company that told us to get out of the CBDC space. Then there was a CBDC vendor, they basically said, hey, we invented CBDC, so we must have um, keynote status at your conference. And I was like, like it was not, that's not the kind of philosophy we ascribe to. We ascribe to being humble, learning, sharing information, growing together, and moving civilization forward, right, instead of back.
How would you define what a CBDC is? And from all of your discussions, what is a CBDC?
Yeah, I mean, in the most fundamental level, it's a digital version of cash. That's the theory, right? But the practicality of it is that it's very, very difficult to pin down what a CBDC is, because a CBDC is a representation of significant amount of philosophy, right, and a worldview, right? So if you look at the Central Bank of China, the PBOC, they have a CBDC. It's not really in production. It's alive. People can use it, but it's not fully in production in the sense that it's permanent. They have a specific view on how it should be used and what its purpose is and things like that. And maybe those are views not necessarily shared in other places. If you look at the Boston Federal Reserve, they came out with some source code 2 weeks ago in working with MIT. And they have kind of a little bit different definition of CBDCs, but it ultimately boils down to like a parallel to cash, right? So they create money. They want to create a digital version of that is intrinsically money. That the bits are itself is money, much like Bitcoin, right? The bits is money, as opposed to the bits representing money, which we already have in the electronic payments systems, right? I can use Venmo and all of that. But if you look at, for example, what the Federal Reserve of Boston has done, you look at the people on the team. For example, there's a guy named Madar Zverza, who is the founder of Zcash, co-founder of Zcash, right? And so you can infer from that privacy and anonymity is going to be a big deal, because that's the clot that Madars is cut from, right? So whereas in the China token, that might not necessarily be the case, that you have significant level of privacy or anonymity, right? I think that remains to be seen. So China will be able to collect an enormous amount of data,
Right.
whereas what the US CBDC might look like is still largely unknown, even to the central banks here, right? So they're still figuring out what does this even mean, and there is, clearly very low tolerance for surveillance and intrusion and things like that. But that being said, central banks are not incentivized to collect data on people. That's not really part of their mandate. They don't have really set up for that. They have really no benefit in doing that. Actually, Venmo and PayPal, they're more incentivized to do that than central banks are. Central banks are more incentivized around financial stability, right? And maintaining a stable inflation rate. So the question is, can you have cash-like? Can you be cash-like anonymous? Can you be as anonymous as you can be if you're using cash? And I think that's a big question. If you're using Bitcoin, as we know, it's very difficult to be anonymous, even though the technology allows you to be anonymous or pseudonymous to some degree. To actually be truly anonymous is very, very difficult. So then you have things like Zcash and Zero Cash, but there is ways to circumvent that. And it may even be possible with CBDCs to be more anonymous than with cash, because when you use cash, physical cash, you leave your fingerprint on it, right? So cash is not entirely anonymous, right? You leave some residue. There may be a physical witness of you using a cash. There's serial numbers on cash, right? So when I transmit cash, if my serial numbers are marked in advance, then there is some traceability and all that. So it's a complex question, and I think right now the CBDC world is trying to understand what these issues are. And I don't think anybody is any major country is not anywhere near rolling out anything significant in terms of a retail CBDC. And I just want to clarify that there's two categories. There's retail CBDC and there's wholesale CBDC. The retail CBDC is what the public would use, and the wholesale CBDC is bank-to-bank tokens, right? So like kind of like a settlement token between central banks. So I think it's still very, very early stages, and a lot of these banks are figuring it out. A lot of them still don't understand a lot of the technologies. They don't really fully understand Ethereum. They don't understand smart contracts. They're just still figuring all of that out. And we help them to learn about these things. Say, hey, this is why this might be important. This is why some technology like blockchain could change how we do things. We could have a different kind of world. But my approach is to be very soft with people, not to really ruffle their feathers or like challenge them or anything like that. To really like say, hey, like, this is we're all in it together. You have kids. You want your kids to have a better future, don't you? And kind of like do it that way, and just kind of I think you'll be surprised that they're very receptive. And I don't know what they'll do at the end. It could be a very draconian position that they take at the end. But so we're basically doing the job of like trying to make it more clear on.
Here's something I found on the web.
Sorry.
According to DaneGarden.com.
Apologize. Yeah, like 10 of them everywhere. So yeah, so I think that's our approach to kind of like get more of the information out, get more of the information out to the public. Because these central banks, one of the reasons they started speaking is that we kind of pulled them out and started having them come out and talk. So every month we have a specific central bank come out and talk. We started with the Swiss central bank, which is very difficult to get to come out and talk, but we got the governor, and he's actually on my WhatsApp, and came out and talked, and that kind of created this momentum of these banks wanting to come out and talk, which I think was very, very important, because you can't live behind these veiled curtains. You really need to come out and explain what you're looking to do. So that kind of created some of that momentum. Not entirely us, but we're a big part of that. And that's continuing. I think that there's now more of like an openness by these banks to talk about what they're thinking to do. And I think a lot of them will tell you that they don't really know. Clearly the smaller central banks are feeling left out. They don't really have the funding and all of that. So there is this disproportionate level of involvement. And then financial inclusion is a big deal. People are trying to figure out, can CBDCs really increase financial inclusion? What we see with the Chinese, and we work with the State Department, by the way. So the State Department is a client, and they asked us to do research on the Chinese CBDC. So in some ways, we're actually helping the US government, because there is an opinion that this is a matter of hegemony, US hegemony, right? And really the only two CBDCs that might really matter is the US and the Chinese CBDC. And everything else might be not much of a concern from a hegemony point of view. So we work with the State Department to help them understand what's happening. And they have operatives in different countries like Mongolia, Kenya, Morocco, trying to figure out what's happening with the Chinese digital currency there, because there is some penetration occurring, and this penetration is being done through ATM machines. So if you walk to an ATM machine in Mongolia and you deposit money, your balance shows a Chinese CBDC of the ECNY. And so they're able to get some financial inclusion, but also drive adoption through just these ATM machines, right? And so who would have thought you can do financial inclusion with the ATM machines? So we see some of that occurring, but really the jury's out around what CBDCs can really change, if anything at all. Can it increase financial inclusion or not? I don't think it's really. I'm not really sure. Some people advocate that you could have better programmability with CBDCs. I don't think that's really the case, because they're not necessarily going to be blockchain based. They'll be centralized solutions, and then you can program them anyway. I can program Venmo and PayPal now through an API. And what programmability means on the blockchain is that smart contract sits itself on the blockchain, right? And not API-based programming, but smart contract-based programming, which doesn't seem to be fitting into the CBDC space currently. So, yeah,
We have a couple of questions. I have a
Yeah.
question too, but
Yeah.
Harlan writes, is it disingenuous to say we do not know what it is? I think referring to CBDCs.
What's that?
Is it disingenuous to say that we do not know what a CBDC is yet?
Why would it be disingenuous? Like we're trying to hide the definition, like we don't want to tell you.
No, you commented on that you had gone around to the various constituencies and they said that everybody's trying to figure out what it is,
Yeah.
right? And that they're communicating that to you.
Yeah, I think my point is that nobody really has a clear definition, but I gave you a very high level, which is like it's a digital parallel to a cash, right? Now what that means in terms of like the devil's in the details, like how do you implement such a thing, right?
Yeah.
So like if we say is Bitcoin a currency, you will get into a massive debate with 10 different sides and positions around is Bitcoin a currency, is it not a currency, and things like that. And you find similar in the CBDC space that there's lots of different design options, right? To design a CBDC, you might have 300-400 different variables that you have to take into consideration. So what really is a CBDC? One country's CBDC may not be another country's CBDC. They might say, well, that's not a CBDC. So I think the definition is emerging, much like definition of a lot of things in the crypto space is emerging, and it's an evolving process. I don't think it's disingenuous. I don't think anybody's trying to like fool anybody or hide anything. I think it's more of an admission of ignorance that nobody really knows. There, if you go to these papers, you'll see a definition,
Yeah.
but those definitions are very broad, right? They're just very broad, then you'll see caveats, right? Well, it depends on how it's designed and things like that. There's a great book by an author named Richard Terran. He's a good friend. It's called Cashless. It talks about cashless. It's about the Chinese digital revolution around currency. I urge you guys to read that. And I think once you get through that book, it's one of the best books out there on this topic. You'll understand that, this is far more complex. And what Richard says is like that what a CBDC is really depends upon the design and the philosophy behind it. But the intent is really to create a digital currency issued by the central bank, and that's backed by the central bank. That's really the overall, I would say, definition of a CBDC. But in its details, it will vary across actor. So depending on what actor is involved, that exact details of how a CBDC, is it a token based, is it an account based, is it legal tender or not? Some banks are saying that the CBDCs do not need to be legal tender. And I was just, before we got on this call, we're talking about how Bitcoin was becoming legal tender at some places. And the rationale is that by making something legal tender, if you walk into a store, then the store must accept it, right? And some banks are saying, well, if we issue a CBDC, we might not need to make it, or we may not want to make it legal tender, right? We don't really need to force it on people. Like, we don't need to force it on some vendor to accept it. And so I think all these little questions that emerge, and some of those questions might seem obvious but I don't think they're that obvious. And so, is a CBDC something that's legal tender? The answer is we don't know. There is no fast and hard universal definition that applies to all nations in all situations. So my view is, because we all can surmise what a CBDC is. At best, it's money issued by digital money issued by the central bank, right? We can say that. But what are its properties, and what are its behaviors, and what protections does it afford? What does it expose me to? Those are all big questions, and the dust hasn't settled on that yet, the least bit. Yeah.
Let's take a question from Randy. You've had your hand up for a while.
Hey, Jamiel, nice to meet you. I think I met you early in the same meetup last year, so it's great to see you again. So my question is more of CBDCs and stablecoins. As the rise of stablecoins go up, what's your just philosophy, or are you hearing? Could they coexist? Is it something that still need to be figured out? So
Yeah, I personally believe they can coexist. And there was one African central banker that I spoke to, actually was in the elevator of this conference, and he's like, I manage 6 countries. I forget which 6 countries, and he's like, well, how do we do a CBDC? And I said, why don't you just create a stable coin, a regional stable coin, right? A multi-node stable coin, and you manage the supply of that stable coin, or you manage the parameters of that stable coin and let the supply be managed by the public and things like that. So I do see that happening, but there's a lot of fear. Like, for example, in a situation where there needs to be a sudden, whether it's good or bad, that's a whole other story, but there needs to be a sudden spike in supply. And we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, like what the Fed has done since COVID. The stablecoins may not be able to do that, right? And so that kind of lever that the central bank may not exist in that stablecoin. But that's not to say that they can't create their own stablecoin that has those kind of properties. So in many ways, I think CBDCs and stablecoins are going to learn from each other. Probably CBDCs will learn more from stablecoins, if anything, because that's where stablecoins is where we see innovation occurring, right? I think we'll see that. I think, the talk that I did about AMMs was Curve, which is a stablecoin swap, which is to indicate that you can view CBDCs as a form of a stablecoin, right? It's a government issued stablecoin, right? And that is maybe one way of looking at it. I remember I had a talk with somebody from the World Economic Forum, and I said, CBDC should be interchangeable with stablecoins. They flipped out. They went crazy. Like, how could you have a stablecoin that's backed by $1, but backed by a fiat that then it's issued by the bank itself? And they saw it as circular, but they were not thinking correctly. A stablecoin effectively doesn't have to be backed by anything, right? Much like the dollar is not backed by anything, right? It's backed by the faith of its people that use it, right? Yeah, there's a military and all that, obviously, but effectively it's faith, good faith. And it's entirely possible that one day DAI, right now you have to over collateralize to mint DAI, right? But one day that collateral ratio can come down, and it's entirely possible that collateral ratio goes to 0, right? At some point in time, and which is like what they did with gold and the dollar. So I think CBDCs and stablecoins and the mixture of the two are very, very interesting. Clearly, stablecoins are can challenge governments and challenge institutions. So they're going to get regulated, and all of that. I think that's all coming. We can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it will probably happen. And my view is that CBDCs will take a lot from the stablecoin world and learn a lot from the stablecoin world. And maybe finally a CBDC will actually just be a nation issued stablecoin, and it's entirely possible.
Interesting. Good question, Randy. Thank you. Carlos has a hand up too. Hey, Carlos.
Hi, Arry. Hi, Jamiel. The way I look at the CBDCs is that it's going to be having everybody. It's now possible to have a direct account with the central bank, right? Instead of having an account with a bank, you are now going to have an account with a central bank. So I think that implies 2 things, and I want your comment on this. Number one, why do we need banks then if we can open accounts directly with our central bank? And then number 2, the other implication of this is that because the central bank is a government entity, it has to follow the laws, the rules, right? And the rules say you have to have KYC, meaning when you open an account with the central bank, you have to reveal who you are. Now, doesn't that defeat the purpose of having the blockchain?
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot in that question. I'm going to paste the link here. I create these infographics. If you go to blockchain101.com, there's an infographic on the different, it says retail CBDC architectures. There are different approaches, right? One's called direct, where you open an account with the central bank. The central banks right now are not favoring that model, right? They're hugely against that model. And then there's other, what's called hybrid or intermediated, where you have the commercial banks and payment service providers like PayPal and Venmo, right, that are in the middle. between.
So the first model basically cuts out the bank, right? The bank, you don't need the
Yeah.
banks anymore. So that
Yeah,
would work.
yeah, but there's nobody that said that this is the approach. There is no
Right.
there is no official approach. Nobody
Yeah.
has decided that, and in my conversation with these central banks, they're not in favor of that. They don't want customer data.
Yeah, because they have the banks that they are supervising, right? There's a whole industry that will be affected if they do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only a whole industry, entire society, right? So if all of a sudden I can't deal with JP Morgan or Citibank for my payroll, my direct deposit, and it's going to a central bank, and I have to call up the central bank, and they're putting me on hold for 40 minutes, it's a problem, right? And so central banks are not tooled up, they're not trained or positioned to do customer service. So that model of you as a retail individual or me as a retail individual opening an account in the central bank probably will never occur. The central banks are not really going to do that unless you're talking about a very, very, excuse me, very small country, a country of like 5,000 people or 10,000 people, some island or something like that. That it only makes sense in those scenarios. But theoretically, all of the models are discussed, not with the intent of implementing them, but with the intent of understanding the pros and cons as an educational exercise. So the BIS wrote a paper, which I based my infographic on, which describes these models. And that paper was like a year or 2 years ago. And since then, there's been even more sophisticated models that have emerged and how.
So what about the Chinese one? Would that be direct or through the banks?
So everybody's using what's called a two-tier model, right? A two-tier model is you have a central bank, and the central bank does not have KYC information, and then you have these commercial banks, intermediaries that do have the KYC information, right, and are doing customer service, and that's the approach that the Chinese have right now, right? It's a two-tier model. They're not using blockchain, but they're using UTXO. So it's a centralized UTXO model. And if you're familiar with UTXO, like Corda uses UTXO, and I have written a whole book on UTXOs and how they work. It's borrowing from it's borrowing from Bitcoin. So you can consider UTXOs as mergeable and divisible tokens, if you will. And so they're using that, but it's centralized because of scalability reasons and security reasons, right? So is it possible to do CBDCs on blockchain? It's possible, but it really depends on performance metrics, right? And so these performance metrics are important if you're doing a national payment system. So, for example, the Open Cbdc platform with MIT and the Boston Fed came out with, which I actually interviewed them 2 weeks ago on a talk that we did jointly. They can hit 2 million transactions per second in a certain specific configuration. And
so I think what I understand from that is, of course, it's going to be centralized, right? Well, it's a central bank, it's got to be centralized, meaning that there is no consensus algorithm involved.
Yeah, I mean, so in the current version of that they have, and this may change because they may be adding other components. They're looking at Byzantine fault tolerance and things like that. But right now, what they produce is not an indication of what they're thinking to roll out into production, right? So we need to separate the theoretical and the academic world and the discussions that are occurring, and not use as an indicator of what the intent is to deploy in the real world, because nothing's going to get deployed in the real world at any time soon, right? The exercise that they're doing with MIT, and I went through the source code, it's beautifully written, well done stuff, is more research based. So for them, they have to take into consideration how do you do privacy and all of that kind of stuff. And they've got some really good minds working on it. The co-founder of Zcash is part of that team, has written that paper that they produced. And if you look at the commit logs, you can see him responding to things, say, hey, we need to use SHA-3 here, not use SHA-256, blah, blah, blah.
I don't think it's a technical issue though, right? I mean, privacy, because by law, the banks have to do KYC. And so meaning that if you want to use CBDC, You have to go through, KYC.
Not necessarily. So the question is, like I said, is if it's cash, like you don't go to KYC for using cash, right?
Right.
If I give you $100, I don't need to go through any KYC process. And the question is, can CBDCs mimic that behavior, where we can move a certain amount of cash freely and without leaving any residue, any digital residue? And anytime you do anything through digital means, right, you leave digital residue. And over time, you can collect enough data to start to pin down who that person is, right? So companies like Chainalysis, they do this all the time. They're setting up fake, not fake, but they're setting up these decoy Bitcoin nodes, and they're setting up these fake websites. These are fake websites where they can go collect information, and collectively they're aggregating massive amounts of metadata about Ethereum and Bitcoin users, and then they're able to infer who that person is and hand it over to the authorities, right? So there may be certain cases where that may be necessary. For example, drug use and human trafficking and things like that. But clearly, it's a slippery slope, right? It can go in all different directions. The challenge, I think, is going to be how do we create a digital thing where it leaves really no residue as much as cash does, or even possibly be even more anonymous than cash, right? So there is that possibility that a digital token, and we're learning this from Zcash and mixers and things like that, that it may even be possible to be more anonymous through a digital token. But these are all questions that are being brought up right now. I don't think anybody there's no government that has said, this is how we're going to do it. Some smaller governments have, like in the Caribbean and things like that. And they've made some mistakes. Like, for example, there's one called Dcash, and they rolled out something and it shut down middle of February. It's been down for 5 weeks, 6 weeks at a digital certificate issue. But I think those kind of countries are really just getting out in front of the innovation curve just to say they got out, right? But I think larger nations are testing the water to see how all this works. I mean, China and the US, Bank of England.
Yeah, I don't believe any government will go to a solution that would allow for anonymous transactions. Like what's going on in the world right now. There's a war in Ukraine, right? And of course, the Western governments, like the US, they would like to be able to make it hard for Russia to get money, right? And so that means that they have to use sanctions, and sanctions involve KYC, basically. So, like if you want to stop the Russian government from being able to use their accounts in the banks around the world, of course, we have to know which accounts those are. And if we don't know, then there's no way to control. And so my point is, I don't think any government can really agree to a system that allows for anonymous transactions. Don't you think?
I don't see any evidence for that claim. I mean, if you're going to make that claim, you need to provide evidence.
Well,
right? I mean,
yeah,
it's very easy to speculate. It's very easy to throw suspicion. Right. So I got out of the suspicion game a long time ago, saying, well, I'm not very cynical. I question all motives, but we have to go by evidence. Otherwise, we will start hurting each other as a people. So I think it's very important to speak to people that are making the key decisions and ask them, say, hey.
It's for the congressman, right? They will make the decisions on this.
I mean, if the U.S. does have a CBDC, it's going to go through Congress, right? Yeah. It's not going to be a central bank by itself to do that. But right now, you have open source code from the U.S. You are in a position to go and question it and say, hey, why is this architecture not doing this, and why is it not doing that? So if you look at the open CBDC architecture, there is a component that does validation of the transaction, and it strips identifying information and then passes it off to a payment processor. And the payment processor, just through hashes, knows whether something was spent or not spent. So they broke it up. Maybe this is a precursor to a very strong anonymous system, right? And we can question it because the source code is there, everything is there. and we can disagree with it. So I don't try to say what a government, I don't try to portray the world as us, them, or this government's evil and this and that. There may be some governments that have, ill intentions around surveillance and limiting all of that. But I think we need to have conversations with them. We need to have this information flow.
I agree.
And it's important to have evidence for anything that we say.
And of course, we have to live in the context of government, right? There is a jurisdiction, jurisdictional aspect to all of this. And if you're not compliant, I mean, you can't do business here in the US. That's just how the way it is. So
you can't do business.
We have to be compliant.
You can't do business anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So you have to comply with somebody, with somewhere, right? So it's a great question. These are great questions, and I think these are questions that we want more and more discussions around.
Mm-hmm. So maybe another. Do you think central banks and the system is open to like re-examining our monetary and fiscal policies? Like eventually going back to like a hard money versus not, or this is just gonna be a continuation and expansion of the whole idea of fiat money, government money, not backed by anything but the faith of the people and guns.
Yeah, I mean, the Cbdc is most likely a continuation of that, right? So as long as the people want a continuation of that. So if the majority of a society says we don't want that, then it's over. But I don't see the majority of Americans taking that position yet. They may down the road. For smaller nations, that it may be easier to make that to change that system, but they're not doing it. So the question is like, is there a democratic process to get rid of central banks, right? And say, well, and then if there is, fine. Then what's the alternative? Is there a democratic process to select the alternative, and how do we govern the alternative? Because either the algorithms govern it themselves, or we govern it to some degree. And we're still very young in this crypto world to really have a full-blown alternative. So for the foreseeable future, the CBDCs will continue to be kind of an extension of the fiat world, for better or for worse, right? And like, I don't try to get into this debate, that's a bad thing or a good thing. All we know is like, it's a thing, and it's going to continue to be a thing. And because the banks are going to keep doing what they do. But is there a world where we can imagine where central banks don't exist, or a central bank in a specific country that doesn't exist? Yes. Is it probably happen anytime soon? Maybe in our lifetime? Probably not, unless there's a radical, massive, revolution, physical, taking up arms. I don't think that will happen anytime soon. If anything, the Russian thing has shown us that these bank systems are going to be more dependent upon to influence and control the global geopolitics, right? And so
a possible scenario would be, the post office in the US has a kind of a monopoly, right? And they kept that monopoly, but now they're not the dominant provider of that kind of service. It's FedEx and UPS, right? So you can have, I imagine, a central bank continuing to exist and continuing the services. And people would use them, of course, because there are cases where you do need fiat money. But then I think my scenario, a scenario I'm imagining is there will be several stable coins competing with each other and also competing with fiat. And I think that's a more ideal situation, because then people have the freedom to choose whichever they like. They want to use CBDC, go ahead, use the CBDC. But if you want to use a stable coin, you're welcome to that too. Yeah, I think that's a better situation.
Yeah, I don't know. We have the freedom to choose today. I can keep my money in euros if I want to, right? I can move all my money to DAI if I want to, but you won't, right? You're not going to put all your money to DAI. You're not going to go to the employer and say, pay me in DAI. because they're not tooled to do that, right? Infrastructure is not really there. So I think choice is great, but that there's all this other tooling that must come with the way of life that we're used to. And so if I'm going to have stable coins as something that I can use, then I need to be able to go to the store and buy milk with stable coins. And if I can't, then I'm not going to. So for us to cover that gap, where I think we as a society are pretty far, there's a lot more work to do. And we're getting there, but I think we do have our setbacks, and like the crypto space moves forward, but then it takes a step back, and then it moves forward and it steps back. And I think it's a process, right? And so
yeah, and the way there is not just through CBDC alone. It is possible to do it also through stable coins, if the stable coins are allowed to continue to operate, because the governments can kill it. It's very easy. Just establish a rule that says you cannot use the backing for anything other than backing. You cannot invest it in a commercial paper. Then nobody will go into that business and it will die.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, stable coins can be banned because if you generate income, you pay taxes, right? And so the question is, do you have liquidity in fiat to pay your taxes for revenues that you generated through stable coins? So I think there's a lot of questions to be discussed. I think the approach that we take is to help highlight more of the questions, and really the main goal is to say this is more complex than it seems, right? There are a lot more issues around what central banks do. If I ask anybody, what does a central bank do? Well, they print money. No, they do a lot more. They do a lot more than that, right? They are part and parcel of keeping a country's financial system stable. Now, can software eliminate that need entirely? I think we don't have evidence to support that. Can a stable coin sustain massive economic shock, right? Has anybody?
Well, I think there is a proof that it's possible to have a multitude of currencies and still be able to have stability. That's what the situation now in the world, right? There are several currencies.
Yeah, but those are
fiat currencies. There is the euro, there is the dollar, and it's stable.
Yeah, those are they're not. I don't know if they're stable, but they're managed, right? Their stability is managed.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Same thing with the stable coins, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the stable coins are managed in a more transparent way.
Yeah, but the question is, if there's an economic shock, what happens to the stable coin, right? If an entire nation is on a stable coin, let's say all of us are using DAI, and all of a sudden there's a massive shock. Let's say there's another, God forbid, pandemic. What will happen to the stable coin, right? So we don't have enough back-tested data to say that. And I'm pro crypto. So it's banks versus us versus banks kind of. I don't really get into that argument. Ultimately, the question is, if we don't go to an alternative, the alternative needs to be robust enough such that it can have the average person on the street can use it easily and conduct their life with that easily. And we're not there yet. We can barely get somebody to get a wallet open the right way. All right.
I think having a multitude of currencies and, but the question of whether that can survive, say, a black swan event, we've seen that, right? Again, because that's required fiat currencies, right?
Yeah, the black swan events has required human intervention. And with DAIs, there's no human intervention, right?
Well,
there
are several kinds of stable coins, right? There are algorithmic ones, there are cryptocurrency-backed ones, and there are fiat-backed ones even. So, I think a multitude of ways, I think, is going to be more stable than just a single centralized system. I think the centralized system is always unstable.
Hey,
I mean, there's no...
Can I interject here? Because we only have 8 minutes. There's a couple of comments that are in the chat. And so, Nick has been writing, you can do business without a legal entity. The IEEE standard is the definition for crypto. And then commentary about MIT effort is not democratic. It's actually a commercial interest getting behind a university name. What do you think about that, Jamiel?
Evidence. Give me evidence.
I can do all three.
It's entirely
Yeah.
possible, but
Yeah.
I'm not here to advocate any specific thing. And I think crypto people need to get out of this like adversarial mentality. Really need to get out of it, right? So I started mining Bitcoins in 2012, right? So I think you need to get out of this adversarial mentality. Like, I'm going to show you what reality is. I think the goal here, right? The goal here is for Cbdc or this conversation is to show like what we've been doing and with banks and talking about, you know, what they're doing. Now, if their MIT has some sponsors behind it and things like that, that may be the case. But that doesn't like, you know, you go to a conference and it's sponsored by all kinds of money. Does that mean that that conference now is compromised? So what we need evidence for is not that there's money going there, is that certain things have been compromised. Is there evidence of a compromise and integrity or things like that, or their stated goal? And you know, if there is, put it out there. Don't put it here, put it out there, put it on a medium.com article and see how people respond to it. I think I'm all in favor of people having you know, there be more sunlight on these topics. But I think we make a mistake by saying, hey, Jamiel, you're talking about CBDCs, you're the enemy. That's what is the implication here.
Yeah,
right?
no, I would say that CBDCs are extremely important, especially if you understand what the world economic situation is and how the U.S. uses soft power by inflation and deflation of the U.S. currency as an index currency. And I think that it takes an appreciation of that and a bigger picture to really appreciate what the nature of those central bank digital currencies are. Speaking with folks, we actually have multiple bankers from multiple central banks who work for us. They're on our crypto economics team. And it isn't an us-them. It's actually quite arm in arm. We've got a number of folks that we work with at the state level to try and influence crypto positive laws that do create congruence to the real world. But I think what we're seeing, and it's very obvious, you start to really get down into the economics of a crypto project versus a regular business, is that because of how it's structured, how the waste has been kind of moved aside, it really doesn't make sense to do things in the commercial way that we've done. So when we're talking about that spirit, you're going to get the range. You're going to get people who are very much on the fringe, and that's necessary because of where the industry is. Like, you have to have a critical mass of those, you know, crazy thinkers and the wild ideas, because they need to be considered and they need to be dismissed or brought up or encouraged to grow, depending upon what it is. And that's really the spirit of the entire industry. Is it's not about trying to figure out any one person what the solution is. It's about using the overall thought process, the overall mental energy of everyone. And I think that's part of the frustration the crypto industry really has, is that there isn't meaningful participation on a project at MIT Lincoln Labs.
Well, I mean, the people behind, like, the guy behind OpenCBC is James Lovejoy. He's a legend in the Bitcoin space.
Well, I realize,
they're all coming from the Bitcoin. They're all coming from the Bitcoin space. Now they work for the Federal Reserve. And then you have the Zcash person, and they're all. I mean, these are heavyweights from the blockchain world that have come in.
Oh, that's the problem, though, is that they're heavyweights. Is that, and that's counter to the spirit of what they're trying to do. It should be a democratic process where there's thousands of people, not
I mean,
not
look,
five
I'm
or
not
six
trying to.
really smart guys. And,
No,
and that's the whole point.
I think what they're trying to do is build a community of contributors, and they just came out. They just came out 3 weeks ago. If you get on the call that they have with the MIT, they're encouraging that the community take control of the project. And actually, one of the questions,
are they looking at decentralizing it, like decentralizing control? Because I mean,
they're open to it. But like,
that would be awesome.
One of the questions I
just to nerd out with you for a moment, if that was something that they earnestly did, that would be probably the warmest embrace they could possibly have to the movement, to lock arms and move forward together harmoniously and not because you stated a good thing. There is this acrimony or this us them thing that doesn't really work in the long term. It does need to come to some level of participation. I think it's there, but I think doing things that I think that community is kind of waiting for the older community to kind of come to them. Right, they want this to happen. So when we make gestures like that, when a group like that makes that gesture, that resonates hugely with the community, and that's how you get both of them working together.
You had what they have is they just rolled out phase 1, and they have plans for phase 2, right? And so the question I asked them, and this is documented, is that if you have plans for phase 2, then how can you have community involved? Because the community can take it in a completely different direction. Right. And their response is, Jamiel, we don't know. We're here to learn from the community, and we're willing to let the community drive this. So they're gonna drive it until a community comes along and pushes it forward. So there is
and that's how to do it. That's cool. I'm glad it's on the roadmap. That's what I was thinking about. It's like it's when that doesn't end up on the roadmap. But you're absolutely right. And I've seen this a bunch of times before, is that you can't put the cart before the horse. You can't just have a community and cool stuff come out that's beneficial. There needs to be structure to set the tone, the pace, the cadence, so that they can have a fighting chance to then organize themselves into, wherever they're going to iterate from there. This is really cool.
Every open source project requires initially at least stewards, right? So Vitalik Buterin has a heavy influence on this Ethereum, maybe less so now, but there are key people that have that influence and will continue. They will tell you what pull requests will get rejected and what pull requests get admitted, right? There is a group of people. So I don't see that any different than what the MIT source code is. And you have these blockchain people in there. Should it be more open? I think they're doing everything that they can to make it as open as possible. And there are PR requests that are going in that are getting approved, and they're getting merged into the source code. I think this is the early stage, and kudos to the central bank and Jim Kuna, who they open sourced it. I don't think there's ever been in the history of any central bank open sourcing anything. So it's a positive step forward. Is it thorough and complete? And it's not. Should we expect more? Yes, we should expect more. But I think the most important thing to have is the conversations. The conversations need to, the dialogue cannot break down. I think we can't throw ideas at each other, right? We can't throw these these high-pitched ideas like you're anti this, and I think that then shuts down the communication. Because it's just people like you and me that are working at these central banks. It's not these evil, I'm going to take over the world. People, they're at their desks like, oh man, I got to work today. But let me trade some crypto and quietly on my phone.
And you don't realize is that when you get involved with the community, it's peopled, with people on the fringe and whatnot. And there's areas where
the fringe defines the future sometimes. Right?
Exactly.
The fringe is important.
But then you start to talk to them, and they're educated like yourself. They've worked at central banks, or they work the trading desk at HSBC, and they see the frustration from the systems from having touched them every day, and they make that, it's so relatable to them when they see the frustration in the general public, and that's where they get I'm excited, and that's where we're at right now. That tells me that we're at that critical threshold, that critical mass, where we can really push it over the top.
Hey, this has been so interesting, and I could think I could ask Jamiel more questions about not just this, but 100 million other things for another several hours. But we're out of time, and I want to be respectful of the time that we had committed to this. Definitely thank you everybody for participating with us. Thank you, Jamiel, for joining us. If people want to get in touch with you or follow you or get in contact with you, what's the best way? Could you
LinkedIn. I'll drop in my LinkedIn, and that's the best way. So I don't really use much else.
On LinkedIn, linkedin.com/IN-JMIEL. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation, and we'll definitely have to have Jamiel come back again, because I know he's a wealth of information and working on so many different things.
When my book is out, the DeFi book is out, that might be a good time. So.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Happy Friday. Thank you.
Bye. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.
All right. Welcome to Windshield Time, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is non-technical, fun, informative way to learn about money, Bitcoin, blockchains, crypto, and digital assets for busy parents and working folks who are curious about these new technologies. Day, Arry, and their guests talk about these evolutionary systems of money and what they do, y'all. Because what part of your life does money not touch? This podcast is not financial advice, and your reactions are your total and complete responsibility, y'all. Now, thanks again and enjoy the show.
What are you doing?
Stuck inside.